Let's hope. Fantastic. I somehow still know how to use Zoom. So thank you all for joining today. My name's Arrow. I'm a PhD candidate at MIT Sloan with the Institute for Work and Employment Research. And I really thank you for joining today. It's really bright and sunny out here on a Saturday afternoon here in Boston. So there are lots of places you could have been this afternoon, and you chose to be here, and we really appreciate that. Can everyone see my screen perfectly okay? Great. So this is a panel on critical perspectives on worker voice. And so this is about research, but also I would hope that you all see this as a call to action for us to think and reflect together on how we're studying worker voice. Just a quick overview on how we're going to spend our time here today. I'm just going to give a quick overview on the panel and also share some preliminary research that I have, a project I just started that can hopefully help really motivate this session. And then we're going to have two great panelists, Yaminette Diaz-Linhart, who just got her PhD from Brandeis, and Phela Townsend, who's a PhD candidate at Rutgers. And then we'll follow that up with Duan Yang, who is an assistant professor at Cornell ILR. And at the end, hopefully we'll have enough time for a really great Q&A. We really would love this to be as participative as possible. Also, just a couple of ground rules. I really welcome everyone who can and who feels comfortable to turn on your camera. It really makes it feel a little bit more collaborative. I know we'd all prefer to be in person. And also, you are totally welcome to add comments, questions in the chat, but the panelists will not be able to get to any of that until the end when we have our Q&A, but still, of course, encourage lots of participation because that's really what this is all about. And so just to share a little bit of an overview today, we're talking about critical perspectives. Maybe we all have different understandings of what that means, but when I'm talking about critical perspectives, I'm talking about that in opposition to what we might consider traditional theories, which are, it's a type of theoretical thinking that involves, objective facts and the application to specific social systems that we're studying, understanding how those systems play out in action, but they're all taken to be seen as external to the theoretical thinking itself. That you can be a blank slate and that the work that you're doing might be totally separated from the systems that you're studying. And so critical perspectives are about understanding how we all have our own unique lived experiences, and those will influence the way that we are producing knowledge. And so it's really confronting that, and also understanding that the theories that we are producing will have an effect on the world that we're studying. And so these critical perspectives are really calling us all to think together. This isn't calling out any specific project or saying that any specific research question is not an important one, but rather really this call to reflect together on how we're asking questions and why we're asking these questions. And so I set this up to bring us to this question of why are we here? We're here for this annual meeting to think about how we're elevating voice and the new voices that we're documenting in the workplace, outside of the workplace. But these were questions that I came up with that I thought were super novel, and actually I've been hearing so many folks asking these questions across this conference, which is fantastic, but really getting reflective as critical scholars thinking about why are we elevating voice now? Voice is so crucial to our field. So why is it that we see this as something to elevate now? And how exactly are we elevating the voice with our research? And at the same time, there is a lot that is new, and we're documenting so many exciting things that are happening. But we're also talking about some things that may not be new to many of us based on our lived experiences. And so again, really reflecting on, what's new here? How is it that this is new, and who is this new to? So that we have some common grounding, I'd like to just share a little bit about worker voice. I kind of want to blow through this as fast as possible so we can get to our panelists. But there have been two streams of worker voice literature that's really been booming over the last couple of decades. One is in management studies, employee relations, thinking about voice as this kind of idea generation, communication. It's largely seen as informal and really specific to a firm. And it's been growing in importance because it's been seen to improve organizational efficiency. And so voice has been something that we've been trying to encourage in organizations as opposed to silence, as a way to improve how our organizations are functioning. And then also we've been studying worker voice in this strain of IR research, thinking about voice as power, voice as influence over how decisions are made, often supported by specific kinds of policies or organizations like unions, where you're aggregating and collecting ideas and problems across many workers. And this has been important to protect our workforce. And this voice, this worker voice mechanism has been seen as an alternative to purely managerial discretion making. It's been important to include workers in how decisions are made. And so these ways of conceptualizing voice kind of see it as an input or an output in how we're relating about decision making. And so I'd actually encourage these two strains of theory to think with each other. Where in management, it's often thinking about how do you find the problem? How do we increase the supply of voice? How do we get more people to talk? And not necessarily thinking about how do we make sure that these problems that are brought up are influencing our decision making. It really stays at the micro level. And then within IR, it's been really about how do we solve these problems that are coming up? How can we increase the demand or the opportunity for folks to speak up? But has been a little bit agnostic to human agency and whether or not people feel like it's psychologically safe to speak up, or how they can bring up their voice. And so I see this entire panel as a call to think about voice as a complicated social process. It's socially constructed. What's considered voice might seem different to different people. And so it's important for us all to really think about this together, about this messy process of voice in and outside of the workplace. And one fantastic example of this comes from Duan Yi, our discussant, in some research that she did at her time at MIT, thinking about why migrant workers in China might not be using these grievance mechanisms to protect them. And it's because of the nature of their employment. It's incredibly social, how these migrant workers are able to access employment. And so they might feel scared or worried to speak up, as it might hurt their relationship with their employer. And so these policies are incredibly important, but they might not necessarily be taking it far enough to think about how workers are participating in this process. And really quickly, hopefully to motivate this a little bit more, I'd love to share some really early stage findings from some work that I've started this year, an ethnography of what I'm considering workplace democracy. Within this unionized hospital setting, they're implementing some committees for joint problem solving with workers and managers to make sure that they're really addressing what's the hardest part about working at this hospital, and how can we include workers in the decision making to improve their work environment. And so from my own field notes, I attended a bunch of these committee meetings, and I attended one on its first day that happened in March 9th, and it was a bunch of managers and workers coming together. The managers were all white, some male, some female. There were also some union representatives involved, and some workers. All of the workers involved were immigrant women, most of them Black women from the Caribbean, but immigrant women, Black and white together. And so while they were thinking about problem solving in this first meeting and introducing this initiative to these workers, they wrote on the chalkboard, the union reps wrote on the chalkboard, we're here, and our goal here is to change how it feels to come to work. And so they posed these questions of what makes it hardest for you to do a good job, questions like this. And senior director and union reps passed out Post-it notes around the room. And so I'll share with you what I saw. Uli, who is one of these workers, this is a pseudonym, not her real name, said, "I don't want to do this," Uli said with a laugh. "What am I supposed to write down? It's the little things." Each time she said little things, she would hold up her index finger and thumb close together and elongate the I vowel in little. "It's about the little things." An RN came up to me while I was working and told me another patient's boot wasn't working. And I'm here feeding a patient. I can't fix the other patient's boot just yet, but she could have. And when I was done feeding, she went and reported me for taking too long with my patient. "Why can't you take care of your patient when you see I'm busy?" It's just these little things. How do I write all that down? And so here, Uli's input, her voice, it's difficult to define. It's really complicated. It's about respect. It's about how she's spending time with her workers and what policies are in place to actually support her to do a good job. And she also seems a little disenchanted here, probably for good reason, about using her voice. And so I contrast this with some notes that I took from a conversation that I had with one of the managers. This is a white male manager, and in the meetings where I observed him, he was often sitting cross-armed and not necessarily even making eye contact with folks as they're speaking. But he continues to show up. And when I spoke with him, he said, I'm glad the workers can be heard. It's stuff I hear on a daily basis. It's nothing new, but at least they feel like they have a stepping stool to being heard. I think that's good. Do I think we will get anywhere with this? I'm not quite sure because it's complicated. There's a lot of pieces to this. Then he gave out this deep sigh. With the personalities in the group that we have, they're going to be the most defensive workers there is. I don't know if that particular group will listen. And then he laughed. I don't know how they were picked, but they're the ones with strong personalities. They're going to speak up, which is what you want. How they receive another perspective is going to be tricky. And so this manager knew about these problems, continues to hear about them, and seems somehow a little bit reluctant to involve workers in this decision making. And so voice here is not this simple, output from a worker where you can just capture this idea or this input into decision making. There's this challenging process here of trying to make our workplaces more democratic, where we really need to dig into what's going to actually help encourage voice here that's actually meaningful. And so I just bring us back here to this question of why we're here, thinking about elevating voice, and really reflecting together on these questions of how we're elevating voice. What's new here? How are these things new, functioning, and actually supporting our workers? And so I'm going to stop here and pass it over to Yaminette. And then Phela will come after her to share a little bit about some of the research she's done that can hopefully help us think about worker voice in a different way from the data that I was just sharing.
Thanks, Arrow, and hi, happy to be here and share a little bit about my dissertation research. Let me pull up my slides. Hopefully, can you all see my slides? Yes, great. I have two screens, so it just looks a little bit funny on my side. So please stop me if something doesn't seem right.
Yaminette, can you, we're seeing both slides.
Oh, okay, 1 second. Yeah, that was my worry. So let me switch to one screen. All right, let's try again. Is that, you can only see, let me put it in presentation mode. Does that work or no? Does this work?
Oh no, the way you had it just a second ago was better.
Okay, like this?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, are you seeing the initial slide? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, great. So I'm going to be sharing a little bit about my dissertation research. I want to just note that all the pictures in my presentation are used with permission from the Mass Community Health Worker Association. And in my next slide, hopefully you can see who are community health workers. Yeah. Great. I'll be sharing a little bit about community health workers, and community health workers are essentially frontline public health workers. They're hired because of their closeness to the community that they work with. And they're hired really because of their lived experience. So a lot of times health organizations or social organizations will employ community health workers to kind of serve as a broker or a bridge to really think about how we might improve community health. On the flip side of that, a lot of community health workers feel like they are the voice of the community in these organizations. And so as part of my dissertation work, one piece of it, I became really interested in this notion of professionalization and why community health workers would professionalize. I can't get into kind of all the details here of the theoretical aspects just because of time. But I was really curious because, community health workers don't really fit these standard economics or sociological reasons of why professionalization would make sense, especially because their expertise is really their lived experience. So it doesn't really set them apart from the lay person. Actually, that is what makes community health workers unique. And so why would they go the route of professionalizing? And so I was really curious about this, and I decided to ask questions around, well, how did they experience this collectively? And basically, is this really more like a form of voice? Like what is kind of happening here? And so I conducted an inductive qualitative study as part of my larger dissertation research. And I just want to make a brief note on my analyses for this, because it really did include myself as a researcher, and also because previously I was a practitioner and I worked really closely with community health workers. I wasn't asking these questions in a vacuum. I was really kind of linking my own lived experience and my own professional work with these questions and with what I was learning as a doctoral student at Brandeis. And so I also looked specifically at stories. I was really interested, one, because I think this is a really kind of important way to understand and look at data, especially if we're thinking about this from a critical perspective. So I was looking at stories. And so when you do the interviews, you don't ask for a story, but you analyze the data in story form. And there are all sorts of fun ways to do that. So I'm going to share what I found, and then I'll share some quotes. I put together this larger, in the spirit of the narrative work, I put together this larger story of why community health workers professionalize. I'm going to walk you through that, and then I'm going to share some quotes. So initially in the 1960s, there were public health funded programs that were employing community health workers. Now, community health workers have existed globally for many, many years, and there's a lot of great evidence in terms of an occupation and scope of work. In other countries, community health workers have do a lot of incredible things, including vaccinate, which they're not. It's out of their occupational scope here in the United States. And so what happened is they're working within this new system of funded health programs, and so they started to meet in networks for mutual support. And at that time, they weren't called community health workers. They didn't have this common name that actually came about as part of their efforts to organize themselves. And so as they developed these networks tied to the work that they were doing, they began to meet on a regular basis through mostly public health conferences. This led to creating their own conference just for community health workers as well. But the focus of when they were meeting, when they were talking to each other, initially it was for mutual support. And then it became about their own self-determination as community health workers, or promotores. So it was really around basically who they are in what they do, and how to determine their own interests for their their profession, for themselves. And this really led to some really wonderful policy changes. As an example, they petitioned to the US Department of Labor to officially include community health workers as a separate occupation. And so that happened in 2009, largely because of their efforts to organize themselves, again, to be able to have more say over how they could do their work, what did the programs look like, because at that point it was really determined by the funders or by the organizations, by the employers. And so through this, there are lots of state associations for community health workers. Massachusetts, where I'm at, has the first one officially, although I think between Mass and Texas in the community health worker world, there are lots of firsts there. And what's happened now is the focus continues to be on professional development, on certification, which is an interesting, poses a little bit of an interesting dilemma. I can't get into that here. And then more recently, especially, there's been a wage movement, but more recently a focus on working conditions, especially given the COVID-19 pandemic. So let me walk you through some of the quotes. So here, this quote is really talking about the community health workers getting themselves together. Community health workers weren't getting adequately supported, supervised, paid, all of those things. And we needed to develop some department-wide policies. And so they kind of organized, this is just a local professional association. They organized themselves and they said, hey, come to this big room here at the end of the hallway. Let's talk about training. Let's talk about supervision. Let's talk about policy. And that was really the foundation. And that initial meeting had about 75 community health workers. The interviewees, the key stakeholders, really talked about why they went the route of professional associations and not with the labor organizing based movements. CHWs decided to go the route of professional development instead of labor organizing based movement that would have affiliated CHWs within labor unions. I remember explicit conversations with CHW leaders who had a family history as well as personal understanding of a lot of racism in the US trade union movement, and the experience of having been marginalized in other health coalitions made people pretty clear that they wanted their own organization, their own identity, their own self-determination. That has been and remains a core theme in search of workforce organizing and development for community health workers. It's going to echo this next quote, has a similar perspective. Although we were a network, when they started to organize themselves, people were really afraid that we were going to turn into a union. The very first question asked, are you going to unionize? And my response was, well, not today. That's not even on the radar right now. However, I can't promise you that we will unionize in the future. People were worried that you'd have to pay us better. You'd have to make sure we had benefits. I mean, at that time, a lot of community health workers still weren't getting benefits, and we're still getting the same services, food stamps, Medicaid, et cetera, that the folks that they're working with were getting. Where I can speak for myself that I would go food shopping several towns over because I didn't want folks that I was working with to see me use my own food stamps. And I probably wasn't the only CHW that was doing that. And so here you can really see how this route of professionalization became a much more viable option than partnering with a union. You have two different perspectives, one from an ally and one from a CHW. And this quote here is really, where are we now and where might we envision community health workers as a profession moving forward? And this interviewee said, I just imagine hundreds of thousands of us who've come from everywhere all over the planet who all identify as community health workers being able to come together to mobilize on behalf of our communities. We're now in a place where this professional association can create an environment for this conversation to come out of the shadows and have a platform, a stage where voice can be amplified. And so this is truly the spirit of what professional associations in the community health worker world are doing. Voice as a process and professionalization as a form of collective voice, really as a channel. Voice as a way to emphasize their identity. Voice as a way to mobilize for their shared interests, and as a way to promote well-being for their communities. And I'm going to stop there and pass it on to Phela. We'll take questions after.
All right, thank you so much, Yaminette and Arrow. I'm excited to share my work, and I'm going to give a little preview because from Yaminette's experience, I'm not positive I can do the share screen and notes thing. So I've got two screens going as a backup. So if you see me doing this, that's what's happening. So I'm going to just share on this screen. And get myself in slideshow mode. slideshow mode. Okay. All right. So for everyone, I can't see who's here, but if you don't know me, my name's Phela Townsend. I'm a doctoral candidate at Rutgers. And I'm going to be presenting on what has been an interesting dissertation process. Some of you are here are familiar to some extent. What I want to do today, though, and as a result, it's been a bit of trying to, I think it's really important to try to align what I'm trying to do here with the conversations that have been unfolding over the course of the last couple days, at least in sessions I've been in, all of which around what it means to be more critical in our thinking on industrial relations. And so it's not so much of an apology, but just know this has been put together in the last couple days of me trying to sort of figure out what makes the most sense for like what I want to present given where I am in my research, but also offer something that kind of meets at least my peers, and I think hopefully other folks in the field, like I think where we are in terms of the conversations that we're having right now. So just wanted to give that preface. Okay, can we go to the next slide? Okay, so, you know, there's been this like emerging conversation, did I miss a slide? No, on, you know, what it means to be critical in our work. Arrow kind of gave, you know, one perspective, which I agree with. I wanted to just offer some other things, so I'll briefly connect that. Next, I'll just to tie together, I think, the conversations that Yaminette, Arrow, and I have been having on some themes that I think are relevant across our work. I want to talk a bit about that. You know, there's this, I don't know if it's a debate, but certainly a conversation of, I think, differing opinions, both in our field, but also broadly in policy advocacy and organizing spaces around what it really means to bring identity into both how we understand problems as well as develop solutions. So I don't know how much time I'll be able to get into that. I want to kind of go through it, but if there's time at the end for questions, I'm happy to sort of circle back on some things that I may go through a bit more quickly. And then in giving that foreground, I then want to talk about my research. Specifically, I want to pull out some key aspects around race and class, and talk a bit about my process in trying to better understand how race and class dynamics show up in this work I'm doing on Black worker centers, and how I think it hopefully will make a contribution in our field and our work once I am finished at some point. I'm knee deep in coding, so I'll just, you know, give that preface. So just quickly, I think these are just important questions to frame, right? So for me, like being critical really means, as you know, folks know who've been in these conversations, it's asking other questions. Mayor Matsuda, critical race theorist, and others really talk about what it means, which is willing to be able to sort of go underneath the surface and to sort of inquire, question, interrogate what is maybe not necessarily visible to the eye in the world around us. It also means, you know, in this context, putting identities at the heart of our work and our activism. And then this other question that I've been sort of offering up in the last conversation that I was in with colleagues, which I think is a really important one for us to consider, is as we have developed certain theories and concepts and understanding of ideas, what is lost or gained in them? We all make trade-offs in our work as researchers, as scholars, but there are trade-offs, there are consequences. We often talk about implications, but I do think it's important to think of them as consequences because, as I think Yaminette and Arrow maybe have said, our work does impact the world around us, and we want it to impact it. So I think this is important to think about. And so, you know, it's not just worker voice, right? It's, well, who's the worker, right? What is voice? How do we understand it? And whose voice are we talking about? And voice to what end? And who's really defining this, right? I think these are the kinds of critical questions for us to be asking So I just wanted to begin with that. In terms of connecting themes that I see across our work, so, and I'm going to talk about this as it relates to my research. One is, this idea of how we've conceptualized worker identities in IR. I think related to that is this question of to what extent does identity matter for how we understand issues that we encounter or take on, whether it be labor problems, worker voice, or other kinds of issues. This other question that I'm sort of interrogating and exploring my work is how do we understand the connections between social identity specifically and voice and the broader institutional context that we find ourselves in? Specifically, I look at how identity, to what extent it shapes the strategic decision-making and actions of workers. And then, this point that Yaminette and Era have touched on, which is how we think about voice as a process. So when is it that workers exercise voice, and how is voice connected to their sense-making that happens in the environments they're in? How do these environments shape what they articulate in the first place, what they end up doing, and how they act? So these are some of the I think, core pieces of my research that I will talk a bit about. As I mentioned, I'm not going to get too much into this right now. I'm happy to come back to it. But it's really this idea, I hope, that identity does matter. To me, it's really a question of how, right? How does it matter? How does it show up? And what are we saying when we're saying identity? This was really just to say that, as we look at a lot of the worker organizing that's been happening as of late, I'm going to plug our Warren report that at some point will be out soon, that we did, where we looked at the worker organizing landscape. We really show in this work that there's a lot of varieties and modalities and forms of worker organizing and voice that we're seeing emerging over a period of time. What we also see in this work is a lot of the workers at the vanguard of these movements are of color, queer, women, and other marginalized communities and groups, and people falling at the intersections. We know this is not new. We've seen this in other movements. In fact, some may argue it's a core piece of, if we look at movements over time. One thing I want to point out, also though, I'm looking at Black workers. I think we often, when we talk about identity, we're talking about, folks of color, women, other, groups. But it's important to know that identity is something in all of us, right? So we can be talking about white workers, and there's still a question of identity, right? It's whether we see it as such. And there's other aspects of identity, right? It's not just racial identity, it's gender, it's citizenship, it is work and occupation. I think the challenge and question for us is how we bring these into understanding labor phenomena that we're studying. So I'm going to move quickly. I want to talk a bit about these tensions that I think are present in our literature that we've seen. Tension specifically around how we've studied and understood worker identities. And so I want to put this quote here, which is from Herbert Hill, who some may be aware of, or it's a larger block quote, but I'll just read a bit from it. So he argued back in 1990s when he wrote this, right, viewing economic or class identities as separate from social identities, sorry, I need to get this picture off my screen, overlooks the historical development of working class identity as racial identity. Even at the point of production, workers are never just workers because they have other identities which carry substantive meaning. Thus, race, religion, ethnicity, gender, skill level, and language contribute to the formation of workers' identities. He then goes on to say, implicit in much contemporary labor history is the concept of a coherent class identity that exists above and beyond these dimensions. For the working class to have been divided by external agencies, it would need to have an original unitary existence. But working class identity does not exist before everything else. It's not primordial, and it's always already divided, even as it's formed. The divisions emphasized by labor historians articulate and define at the workplace and in the community social identities that are fundamental in themselves. Inevitably, multiple factors will determine the identity of workers, race and gender being foremost among them. So, why isn't this moving to the next screen? There we go. what I'm getting at here is this idea that, I haven't been moving my note slide, so I'll just speak off the dome. What I'm getting at here is, before I get into this current slide here on the Combahee River Collective, is, Herbert Hill is speaking about labor history and the tradition there, but I think the same could be said and argued of the predominance of work in our IR literature. And there are tensions. We have a, I guess, tradition of largely looking at worker identities as like fundamentally class-based, as or focused on occupational identities, or where the workplace is sort of the orientation and the grounding of it. But this makes sense, right? The workplace is a core part of our self-concepts of who we are, of our identities. At the same time, right, there are more social identity aspects, right, that also are important parts of how we understand who workers are. I mean, one of the things we often hear, and we've been hearing, I think, more resoundingly and loudly from folks, is saying, like, how do we understand workers as whole people, right? As people who are working but also living, and in fact, the boundaries between work and life outside of work are often blurred, right? In particular, in the sense that, if you are, for example, let's say Asian person, and there's been a large anti-Asian backlash or violence happening around you, right? When you go into the workplace, that doesn't leave who you are at the door, right? You bring it in. And so the point here being is that, we have a tension even in our literature, because people have written on the importance of both social identities and more class-based, and I go to the point about class, or economic or workplace identities. And I would argue that where we need to be heading is sort of how we understand the integration of these things, of class and class identity, as well as other social identities and their interconnection. So that's where I'm heading with this. But I just wanted to sort of hold up, this quote here from the Black feminists of the Combahee River Collective, where they make this statement, this argument, right, similar to Herbert Hill, that says we need to articulate the real class situations of persons who are not merely raceless, sexless workers, but for whom race and sexual oppression are significant determinants in their working and economic lives. So what does this mean? So for me, it's myth for us as researchers to treat class identity as separate and severable from other social identities that workers hold, particularly as we've evidence affirmed in other disciplines that those very identities are the impetus for economic inequality, for example, and other forms of inequality. So class itself, right, is a social identity that is racialized, gendered, and other, right, that's shaped by other forces and processes that are hierarchical in nature. So where does my research come in with all of this? And actually, sorry, I just want to make sure, Arrow sent me a note, I don't know how long ago. I just want to—
You have about 2 minutes, Phela.
Okay. I can circle back to this. About how and where critical race theories come into this. I will talk a bit about, and I can come back to my methods and design. But I want to show here, so the central question that I really interrogate is, what is a Black worker center? It's a critical analysis of race and class and worker organizing. But here, going back to this point about what it means to be critical about the concepts that we are dealing and working with, what I essentially end up doing is sort of, if you take Black worker center, right, there are different aspects and components even embodied in this, right? So with Black, there's a question of what is race? How do we conceptualize it? How does race actually show up in and shape the context and experiences of people, of workers, right? In this context, it would be organizers and strategists of Black worker centers. That's the context I'm focused on. Then you look at worker, right? So implicit in this is this question of what is class? Who is a worker in the first place? Again, how does class show up in and shape the context that these organizers and strategists find them in? But then you have to look at what it means to be a Black worker, right? Implicit in this is there are interconnections and even tensions between race and class. Who is a Black worker as opposed to, is that the same as a Black doctor? Is that the same as a Black private equity, right? Like investment banker, right? There's a class piece here. Worker centers or Black worker centers aren't organizing all workers, all Black workers even. And then there's this piece on a worker center and what it is, right? And so there's important piece here about what role a worker center is actually playing. What are the institutional, economic, and social political forces that give rise to them? Why are there worker centers in the first place, right? What gap are they filling? Janice Fine, of course, and others have done work that has answered that question. And I'm sort of bringing in to question and interrogate whether there's something new that can be offered by looking at this whole concept or idea of a Black worker center, right? Why do they exist? What work are they doing, both in the communities they're in, but also in the labor movement more broadly? So there's kind of three main things. I know I'm low on time, but there are three main things that I end up doing as I interrogate this question, right? And so this connects back to how we understand these race and class specifically, but I want to point out they are interconnected with gender and other social identities as well. That it shows up in the analysis. So one, how and through what kinds of processes and mechanisms do race and class show up ultimately to shape these organizers' experiences, but also in turn their strategic decision making? There's an implicit question I think it's important for us to consider is why choose a Black worker center in the first place when there are presumably other kinds of power building pathways one could choose, joining with other unions, going the way of a faith-based institution or other form of community activism or economic development. What is this Black worker center doing or offering these workers? And how do we think about it in the context? I also look specifically at their activities. So why choose certain campaigns over others? Why focus on organizing and or service or advocacy, which, as we know from Janice's work, is largely sort of the three combinations of activities that worker centers engage in. So I look at these questions all through this lens of how race and class and other identity structures shape this strategic decision-making that these organizers engage in. I talked about this last piece here just now. So I know I need to be ending. I was going to kind of take us through like how I've sort of delved into other theorizations, so specifically theories, critical race theory, racial capitalism, but also other aspects of ideational institutionalism and other areas of political economy have been very helpful in helping me to develop a way of thinking about how to understand the race and class and other identity structures that these Black organizers in Southern California found them in. How does that inform how we think about the emergence of Black Worker Center, why they're formed in the first place, as well as the other strategic decision-making activities that these organizers choose to engage in? The last piece I'll just say, and I know I'm on time here because this has come up and I'm happy to talk more about it, is this idea of, identity not being just a micro level construct, right? It shows up both, not both, but in the micro, the macro, and the meso. And so I integrate what's called strategic action field theory, which is a meso level theory, but it really allows me to unpack certain processes and mechanisms through which to understand race and class and how they show up in turn to shape the strategic decision making of these workers. So happy to talk more about this. Again, I wanted to kind of just take you through the process I've been engaging in. And if we have time for questions, happy to talk more and maybe even share an excerpt from one of my interviews that I think speaks to this. So I will stop there.
Well, thank you, Phela, and thank you, Yaminette, as well, for bringing us into your research sites and all the important thinking that you've been doing. I'd like to now just pass it over to Duan Yi, our discussant, who's going to synthesize and help us think through all of these things together.
Great, thanks, Errol. Can everyone see my screen? Perfect. So I will start the presentation. And yeah, I'm very excited to read the paper from two promising young scholars in our field who push the conceptual boundary of our worker voice research. And both papers investigate an old problem in our IR literature, which is what kind of form of worker voice or worker representation do workers want? But these two papers put this old research question in the IR literature in a new light. And the two authors asked, how do workers' professional identity and their racial identity affect their choice between the traditional union organizing effort and the new forms of alternative worker voice channels? And to give you a quick overview of the worker voice research, in the past decade, worker voice was largely seen as an extension of Albert Hirschman's conceptualization as a way to change rather than to escape from an objectable state of affairs. And in our IR literature, this exit and voice model was mostly influentially used by Freeman and Mandoff in their theory on the collective voice phase of the trade unions. So although the trade union today have been and should continue to be one of the most important worker voice channel we should have, over the last 40 years, as we have seen that American workers have experienced a decline in their unionization, and this makes the traditional IR worker voice emphasis on collective bargaining way too narrow. So today we know that union alone are not enough to close the voice gap workers' experiences. And to close this voice gap, it requires us to develop and to evaluate multiple option systems of worker voice in contrast to both the labor law and the prevailing practices. And this also requires us to challenge our traditional conceptualization of worker voice and to evaluate alternative worker voice channels and to understand how do the marginalized group of workers exercise voice in their everyday lives. So today we are very fortunate to have two bright young scholars in our field who offer the new conceptualizations of worker voice and evaluate workers' use as well as workers' satisfaction of these new voice channels. And both paper root worker voice in the nature of work. But these two papers, I think they offer they conceptualize the nature of work and worker voice in very different ways. So firstly, in Yaminette's paper, she conceptualized voice as an occupational citizenship. So in her work, I think work was viewed as an activity pursued by members of a community entitled to a certain right. And this view of work is largely aligned with our conceptualization of work in the traditional IR literature, because the IR research tradition has been focused on voice as a form of industrial democracy or as a form of self-determination on our employment conditions, such as the organizational performance or our compensations, right? So traditionally, the IR literature usually focus on the unions and collective bargaining, but in Yaminette's paper, she looked at a much less studied voice channel, which is occupational association. And I think her finding is kind of surprising because she finds that the community health workers should choose a low-key organizing strategy, and then they decided to go the route of the professional development instead of a labor organizing-based kind of movement. And this research, I think it raised important questions about whether community health workers' distinct identity moderate the effect of the common determinants of our traditional organizing effort. And in contrast, in Phela's paper, I think she offered a very different conceptualization of work. And in her dissertation research, work was viewed as a social relation. And I think she assumed that the human interactions are embedded in social networks, in social norms, and in socially constructed power relations. And as I argued in my IR review paper, the IR tradition has largely ignored the potential role of social relationship outside of the workplace. But I think in Phela's paper, she offered a similar but a much stronger critique of the traditional IR research. So she argued that the IR scholar has largely viewed worker identity as being largely determined by class reductionist or the workplace-based designations, as opposed to the social one. And these perspectives are commonplace in our literature, and it influenced how the field has theorized and written about the class struggle, about worker voice, and about the decision-making in organizing and collective actions. So if we accept this alternative conceptualization of work, I think we should view the social identity as a window to understanding the new forms of worker voice, the new form of worker solidarity and power. And in Phela's dissertation, she asks, why do Black workers decided to form Black worker centers instead of organizing a union or to pursue other strategies of community advocacy? And her research extends the research on worker voice by drawing on new ideas and theories from critical race theories, from a social identity theory and strategic field theory to understand how marginalized groups of workers exercise voice at work. And in addition to these two authors' contribution to the IR theory of voice, I think both papers also made a significant contribution to the research methodology on how should we study worker voice. So I think the traditional IR literature has been a disproportionately used deductive research method, such as the survey data or experiment. And this is because I think the traditional IR literature usually adopt a rationalist perspective in which voice is usually modeled as a strategic choice under a very strong assumption about well-specified worker preferences and specified outside options workers have and rationality. But I think this research tradition has largely ignored workers' subjective evaluation of the experience at work. And the research paradigm has largely isolated the everyday complexity and the social institution from their research. So for example, today I attended another talk about worker voice and in another section, and the presenters are study worker, the home care workers' voice, and they are saying, oh, in our survey questions, a lot of workers do not know whether these questions apply to them or not apply to them. So in today's presentation, I think both Phela and Yaminette kind of choose a different research methodology, and they put the workers' agency at the center of their analysis, and they both use inductive research methods to investigate workers' subjective evaluation of their experience at work. And both authors have abandoned the focus on the measurable behaviors, and they both include analysis of meanings and interpretive communications of social interactions. I think their research focused on the meanings embedded in our social practices, and the worker voice is represented in and through the cultural system in which workers are embedded. And both of their research illustrate how workers interpret their use of voice channels differently, and how do they respond to workplace issues in a culturally specific and variable ways. So in summary, I believe that today is a very exciting period of time for the IR scholars and IR practitioners to study worker voice, as we know that workers today still want voice on a broad range of issues, but there continue to be a voice gap between what a worker expected and their actual say. And today's presentation has drawn from a very diverse theoretical perspectives, and both authors analyzed two distinctive voice channels, and also they identified a broad range of implications. And their research has shown that the IR scholars can enrich our theory by learning from other intellectual traditions, such as the critical race theories. And they also illustrate how the IR scholarship on worker voice can contribute to other literature, such as the professionalism literature, as Yaminette present. So I wish our IR scholars will keep contributing to the worker voice scholarship, and our practitioners will keep broaden our practice on worker representation. So together, we are going to keep worker voice as a vibrant area of study and produce work that is both relevant to the everyday life of workers, and it is also relevant to the everyday practice of the organizations. All right, that's all I have today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Duan Yi. I hope everyone can just extend some applause to Duan Yi for being our discussant, and for Phela and Yaminette for their really fantastic research presentations. We have a few more minutes, and we also have a question, or maybe a couple questions in the chat. Michael, I was reading your question, and I would love if maybe you could turn on your mic and maybe share a little bit more about your question and what you're hoping to hear from the group.
Sure. Well, let me first compliment the two papers. I love seeing scholars doing great inductive work that really kicks up theoretical questions in the way that they both effectively did. Yeah, voice is such a robust and broad category that it can apply to everything, and it can inspire, certainly amongst people who haven't thought about it, a new way of thinking about work on the one hand, but it's such a broad and vague category. I mean, to me, it's always conditioned by the degree of power or lack of power that workers have, given that employers intrinsically have power in the workplace. So I'm just wondering from their case studies, if they can identify under what conditions of existence, power or otherwise, where voice turns out to actually be meaningful in impacting workers' lives for the better.
I can just briefly kind of answer part of that. One of the ways that community health workers have been able to build power, especially in the context of working in healthcare, social services, where it's very hierarchical and people have lots of, initials behind their names, that developing a common professional identity is really the mechanism to build power. So they're generally pretty powerless considering the context that they're in. And so I think this channel really is serving to build power, which I think is one key condition, is the lack of power based on the context that they're in. And then being able to look toward their community, the communities they serve, and then each other as a community to be able to build that power.
And I'll just quickly respond to Michael and then Tom's great comment as well. To me, what is implicit in CRT, racial capitalism, strategic action field theory is power. So if I understand, I think it's thinking about it both ways. So there's power over, right? Like, how do power structures impose on workers? And then there's power to, which is how do they build and mobilize, right, power. And so I'm actually trying to look at both of those. I think the interesting thing about identity is that it sort of sits in the middle, right? It's both workers' agency is connected to identity, but it's also, and this is what I didn't get to speak on about the macro, is it's also embedded in the laws, policy, rules, and norms, right? And so both of these things are acting. And so, like, to your point or question, Michael, for me, it's really thinking, not just thinking about, but it's hearing from these workers. They're answering this question, right? I'm really getting at how they make meaning. In some ways, power is only as meaningful as how people understand it, and then how they exercise agency, right? So I guess to answer your question is I'll have to find out more. The workers I'm dealing with find themselves always engaging with power structures. It's really a matter of just how they understand it and how that gets translated into the actions that they take. Hopefully that gets at it a bit. The point that Tom made, I think, is really important. So what I'm hoping to learn through this work is, and I didn't get to go into it, but I use mixed qualitative methods. It's not just interviewing, it's also using other aspects of participant observation, where I've spent time with them in spaces, as well as participant action, where they've actually pulled me into some elements of the work to really kind of understand. And what I'm actually exploring is this intersection, right? So I've talked about it in some ways as race and class, although there's other identities that play in. Many of these organizers are queer, are women of color. And so I think part of the learning for me is kind of figuring out in what context, to what extent, do we see both the workplace identity and the social identity coming up against one another, and actually it's all about them being intersected. And so part of this is about understanding what is the intersection and how does it actually show up in observable, empirical ways that give us important information about, I'm interested in power building strategies and methods, right? I'm interested, but there's other things I think we can learn from this. So hopefully that gets at what you've raised.
Thank you for the great question and the fantastic responses. And I see all of this great engagement in the chat, but I'm sorry that we do have to end it now. I hope that we can continue these conversations. I mean, this has been fantastic, and it's been great to see the engagement in the chat and to hear this discussion. So I hope we can continue this, right? I mean, the point is for us to continue to work together as we grapple with what the right research questions and methods are. So thank you all. I'll stop recording now, and I hope you're able to enjoy the rest of your day.